Okay, hey there, Technomasters. It's episode 2 inside of this little short WordPress plugin development tutorial. And today we're going to be covering shortcodes. So this is part of a series. So if you haven't watched the first one, check the links down below so you can get access to that. In that previous one, we covered hooks, filters, and the metadata that you need to get your plugin recognized by WordPress. So we're going to be expanding on that now, and that's going to be the same for this entire series. Okay, so one of the great things about WordPress is its use of shortcodes. And shortcodes allows us to give the theme developer or give the end user of the administrative area of WordPress the ability to add shortcodes inside of the posts, inside of their pages, inside of widgets, or pretty much anywhere, mostly in the site where shortcodes is supported. It's pretty much everywhere. Now, that allows us to give them a list of different functionality so they can place this anywhere that they want to inside of their layout and their theme and at any time. And WordPress gives us a lot of kind of functionality here. So we can take these and we can pass parameters into them, allowing the users to customize this even further, giving them a lot more freedom inside of their experience. So today we're going to look at how to create shortcodes. We're going to look at how to create them alongside attributes. We're going to look at enclosing them inside of content. We're going to look at nested shortcodes and how to handle those. And then we're going to have a quick discussion just also doing this around security and best practices that you might want to keep in mind, as well as some advanced use cases inside of shortcodes. So let's get into that quickly. Okay, so just before we look at the code, let me show you what that's actually going to translate like inside of our application. So here I've got my first one. So that's HTH simple message, and that is going to output me this message. Versus if I change that out to, for example, current date, we're going to do one on date function. So when I refresh this page, I get a date that's getting output there. Again, that one doesn't have any formatting or anything to it. We're going to also look at, for example, taking attributes in. So now I've got that message, I've got the attribute. Now if I refresh this, I've got my message. Another example will now be, let's just say this one we're going to look at. And now I get a nice clickable link. It'll open up another page, allowing me to use that kind of flexibility. Which won't really do much for us now because I'm not passing any kind of specific hook to that one. We're creating multiple kind of tabs. And I have these tabs. They're obviously not starting now because I don't have proper JavaScript in here. But just to kind of show you where I'm loading up different ones. One where I can actually manipulate a post and actually put back some posts. So I'm going to create some posts in there. Not that I have much here anyway, because I don't really have anything in that category at the moment. I don't have a category of news. So if I do take that out, I'm going to save it. I'm going to get my 2 little hello world posts. I've got 2 here with 2 different spellings. We're going to look at, for example, doing a login message in terms of that. So when we do that, we'll sheet on the front end a new thank you and see if you are currently logged in as a user. We will also be looking at kind of handling caching examples. So in this one, I'm going to pass some data in, and let's imagine that'll have some logic. We'll look through some caching. So if I do refresh that, it's going to take the data, but it's going to give it instantly back because of whatever we are working on. So we can kind of get through some caching examples. We are then also going to look at creating and handling Ajax forms using shortcodes. So in this one, I'll put a little message here. Not formatted, of course. Hit submit. Sorry, if I would do that correctly. And it's going to come back with a little message response there for me once it's done some processing. So we're going to look at doing all of those in this session. So let's get into it. So essentially, shortcodes allows us to embed dynamic content anywhere in WordPress, specifically on the posts and pages sections of the site. They essentially use a square bracket format that opens with the name of the shortcode, and then following that, any parameters that we want to pass into it. And a classic name equals value, whatever we're gonna send in. Traditionally, you can look at shortcodes in three major formats. The first is the typical shortcode, which is a self-enclosed. In other words, just the name inside of the brackets. Second is that when they're adding attributes to it, is shortcodes with attributes, where we're passing attributes alongside of those brackets. And then the last one, as we mentioned, that is enclosed shortcodes, which essentially when we have an opening and a closing tag version of shortcode with content inside the middle that we're passing in to use. The core shortcode functions that you'll be using inside of your plugin development is add_shortcode, where we give the name of the shortcode as the tag, and then the callback function that should be fired at wolf when it's utilized. Remove_shortcode, where we want to remove a shortcode, again, just passing in the name of the shortcode. Shortcode_exists, if we want to check for the existence of a shortcode. Do_shortcodes, where we can pass in the content we want to execute. Strip_shortcode if we want to actually remove shortcodes from content that we are receiving. Shortcode_attribute, which allows us to parse the attributes of shortcodes. And shortcode_parse_attributes, which is essentially the same thing, but just as a string of text. So let's look at some basic examples. So the very first one I'm going to define here is I'm going to just go ahead, as we mentioned, I'm going to use the add shortcode. I'm going to give the shortcode name that I want the user to utilize, which will be then used pretty much inside of the brackets. And then I'm just passing in a callback function to it. So very straightforward in terms of that. All right. And I'm able to go with all kinds of variety. Again, this is a fully flexible, it's your normal PHP, so you can do anything you want inside of the shortcodes. You can generate dates and output correct dates. You can do calls to APIs or whatever you need to. And the only thing that I'm going to recommend that what you do is, if you are working with dynamic data, again, to escape the HTML that comes back, because again, you don't know what the theme is of the user, and that could break that. Now, let's just say I want to actually start utilizing some attributes. How would I do that? Well, to pass in attributes is actually very, very simple as well. So let's just say we have a bracketed statement, which is our shortcode, which then has our shortcode name, and it's got two attributes that we're passing in, message and color. So we will define the shortcode in the classic way, but we will pass in the parameter for attributes. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use the shortcode_attributes in order to define the attributes. And that takes in three parameters. So the first parameter is kind of like the safety fallback. That is to say, we're defining values in case the user did not define them. And the second one is then the actual attributes the user did define. And then finally, the shortcode name that we're utilizing. So that's how we kind of register or set those up. So in this case, it's also just, again, good practice to make sure you're sanitizing the text, sanitizing the hex color. And WordPress offers us a lot of different, sanitization functions and cleaning functions. We can maybe look at that in a future lesson. And then we can also look at, for example, in this case, I have the is in array in case I want to look at different conditions that are available and set. And then that I will use for whatever the actual purpose is of my use case. So in this case, I'm just going to be returning this formatted HTML based upon that data. I'm doing a sanitize_text for text. I'm using escape URL, escape_URL to escape URLs for my string. The rest I'm just checking if it's is in array. So if I've got any of those values kind of set or defined, so I know what to look for in terms of my style attributes or however I want to return my HTML. And then I can also have my disabled or false, which can come in as a string or will come in as a string. So I want to maybe set and validate that as a Boolean, for example, using filter validate Boolean, which is a standard PHP for you. Now, next up would be enclosing shortcodes. So that would be shortcodes that have a piece of text inside of the middle between two opening closing brackets that we can pass in. That's usually utilized for the sake of, for example, firing off another shortcode within another shortcode. So you want to handle that, but you'll handle that slightly different, because as you'll pass in the attributes, you'll pass in another parameter for content. So let's look at that. So in this instance, I've got my HCH box, which I've defined here. And it does contain a parameter of style. And then inside of it, there's the content. Now, that content can be my other shortcode that I could be passing into it. And then essentially what happens is the code will have the first attribute, which is the attribute. First, your callback function will have the first value, which is the attributes. And then the second parameter will be the content that you pass in. And again, just default those in case the user doesn't put anything in there. And you already know that set up the shortcode attributes, passing in the defaults, the user generated, and then the callback method shortcode that they're linked to. And then here, obviously, we'll filter and sanitize and process our details. And then what we'll do is we'll run the do shortcode content on that. Now, again, that's just an example. You don't need to do a do shortcode content. You could do an action. You can do a filter. You can do a variety of other things. It's really up to you what you want to do with that content that comes in. Maybe you just want to put it out as text. It's really your choice. Now, the only thing I'm doing here as like an additional one, just in terms of quality, is because I don't necessarily know what the user is going to be doing in terms of what they're putting inside of that or what that's going to end up with. I want to make sure that I sanitize that. And I'm using WP_cases. So cases is quite a great function because it allows me to validate HTML or essentially remove or allow certain HTML characters to remain inside of it or tags to remain inside of it. So in this case, I'm basically saying to this, here's the content that we're going to be working on, but allow only this HTML to be inside of it. So only P tags, BR strong. So any other tags, strip that away. So I've got a nice cleaned up content, depending if the user put something in there or a filter or something else impacted it. Okay, and then I'm doing whatever else I'm going to be doing. So in this case, I'm just generating some HTML with this. And I'm good to go from there. And then I just return my HTML or my final output again. So that kind of shows us how to handle that. Now, a little bit more of an advanced case is, what happens if you have multiple shortcodes inside of shortcodes. So let's just say you have a shortcode that almost acts like a table, and you have other shortcodes that are going to act like columns inside that. And maybe the user is going to have 2 columns, 3 columns, 4 columns. And in that case, he's passing in multiple shortcodes inside of that enclosure. So here's an example of how you might handle that. So in this instance, I have a usage where I have my opening TB tabs, right? And that's going to call up this function. That then contains a singular HT tab and another singular HT tab. So in other words, I'm creating a tabbed interface here, and I'm passing 2 tabs in it with both of attributes as well as content. So they're enclosing shortcodes. In this example, I'm still just passing in the attributes, and I'm still just passing in the content. It's just how am I going to handle what's inside of it now? So firstly, as usual, I'm passing in my shortcode attributes, which is the first one is for my tabs, right? So if I'm going to have anything in terms of that. So in my case, I'm going to have an active, and I'm going to have a style of default because I want to know which one is available first. So next, I'm creating a global variable by which I can just kind of store those tabs and then I'm going to be working with, and I'm setting that up as an array. Now I'm going to process each of the content that I've gotten inside of this piece. Because remember, my 2 tags coming in, even though they're enclosed, they're technically inside of an enclosed shortcode as well. So that information coming in between here is technically enclosed content. Okay, so that is essentially what I am looking at. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fire off do shortcode on this content, which I'm going to be getting as the HD tabs. So if we just scroll down here, we get my HD tab and my HD tab shortcode. That's what it's going to fire off. And it's setting up each of those with an attribute of title. And all it's basically doing is it's looking at that globally defined HD tabs data, and it's passing in an array with the title and the content information for it. So essentially, I am firing that off, and it's going to go into this. It's going to fire off twice, allowing me to essentially then have an array, essentially allowing me to have 2 items inside of this array. Once that's done and I fired those off, I'm basically just going to check, are they empty? And if it's not empty, I'm just going to handle that. And now I can handle all the data because now I've got everything that I need to. So here I'm just basically generating some unique values here so I don't have any conflicts. And I'm basically just building up my HTML. Right? Because now my HTML is going to have those tabs. I've got an index, and I'm just basically going to go and loop over that. So I've got my 2 tabs that I've got there. And then for each of them, I'm going to set this up based upon what my active tab is, which I've defined inside of my parameters as my first one here. So with that, I'm building up my headers of my net or my navigation of my tabs at the top. And then I'm just putting out my content at the bottom. Again, making sure that I'm escaping any kind of values there and just showing up the content that is available inside of that. And now in this case, I'm just adding some JavaScript logic so that I'm able to actually click on those features and have them. They're not magically just going to appear for me. Now, besides obviously creating your shortcuts of your own functionality, you can also integrate into WordPress's existing functionality, such as, let's just say we want to get a shortcode that pushes out posts of a certain amount in a certain category. Now, here's a quick example of that. Let's just say I want to grab the recent posts, or that's what I'm calling my shortcode, grab recent posts. I'm firing that off, and I am passing some attributes to it so the user can customize that. For example, 5 posts, if they want a category, show date true, with an order by that goes with that. I'm going to sanitize, as before, that information so it's nice and clean. And then I'm going to build up a query. So it's just building up the primary query for actually loading up the posts. And then I'm going to just check if I'm going to handle those conditions if the user passed in the category, or if they didn't, or any other parameters. And then in this case, I'm just going to call the get_post function. I'm going to pass the query that I had to it. And then I'm going to build out the response the way I want that to be. So again, allowing you to just customize the HTML or any of those things, giving you complete freedom. Again, when you're a theme developer or plugin developer, a very useful tool, especially if you want to make your tools available for the theme developers to customize based upon what they need. Now, in the same way, we can also check for user or logged in activity or authentication, same as we did in the previous example or the previous session when we looked at hooks. And I showed you the user can manage or can have, so we can look at their attribute. When we looked at the user's roles and also picking up what the user can do based upon those inputs. So here I've got another one, HCH_login_content. And that is going to just look at a shortcode. And maybe there's a little bit of a message or a shortcode that I want to fire off for the user there. And essentially, I'm doing the same thing. I'm passing in I'm doing shortcodes first, and then I'm just adding conditional logic based upon that. So I'm going to go like is underscore user logged underscore in. If they're not, then I'm going to drop out this little message for them and give them maybe a redirect URL to go to the login page. So w_login_URL, and then get the permalink. So I've got a solid URL for that. And I might as well then kind of pass that or put that link in there, making sure I still escape the URLs. So it's clean for HTML, and then just return that. And then assuming the user is logged in, I can just go and grab their role from the attributes. I can just, for example, take a role that I'm looking for, and then I can see if that is empty or not, if there is a role. And otherwise, I can then go from the current user, WP get current user, and I'm going to grab that role off of the current user's role, same way we did in the previous one. And I'm going to handle that situation that way. Okay, and then let's redo that part. Okay, then assuming they are logged in, I might want to check for a role. Maybe I want to restrict this to certain role types for this message, or I want to have different conditions on different roles, whatever my choice is here. That's why I'm passing it as a parameter. And then I am just basically going to check if that's, not the case, don't do anything or just be quiet. Or if it is the case, maybe give them a specific permission, or tell them that they don't have permissions to do something if they're logged in. So in this case, I'm just, again, using the w_get_current user that we looked at in the last video. And that's going to give me the user. And off of that, I'm going to get the attribute of roles. And then I can make sure, is that role actually available in the roles that I want to have seen for this section, or I'm going to hide it. So very simple, clean. So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach that. So one of the other things I might want to keep in mind is maybe there's a lot of repeated logic for my shortcodes. And this is just something you want to keep in mind in general when you're doing a lot of WordPress development, is you want to reduce the overhead as much as possible because of the performance. It could be hundreds of other plugins running on that site. You don't want to have yours responsible for slowing down the system. So one of the things that we can use is the get and set transient, which allows us to essentially set caching options. So if we've got certain users, maybe there's queries, and maybe, for example, they're checking the weather. And now instead of having to call that API endpoint every single time, we can maybe check if it's within a certain time period, and then not to call it, but to write it to the cache and then read it from the cache. So let's quickly look at that one. So in this one, I've got my little expensive operation, so to say. And let's just imagine it does a lot of complicated stuff. So I'm firing this off traditional. You're going to do the shortcode. You're going to get your attributes, as you already know. In this case, I'm just also hitting a default, and I'm creating a cache limit of an hour for myself, which is the one I want to use. And then I've got my data, which essentially is what I'm passing in, whatever that value is, my cache time that I'm creating for myself. And obviously With this, I can allow the option to the theme developer to modify that. And then I'm creating a simple kind of cache key. If you're familiar with Redis or any of the others, it's a very similar idea, key value pairs. So I'm defining it based upon, again, a unique name. I'm putting in a code here. Obviously, you'll have a structure that maybe works based upon the convention of the use case. So you're not randomly generating it every single time the call is, as in this one. And then the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to see if I can get that transient. In other words, can I get this cached information? Is there something there? And only if there's not there, well, if it is there, then I can just return that data and I don't have to do any of the other executions on it. But in this case, and this is only for demonstration purposes, I can sleep this, obviously give an example of it taking longer, and then I can just generate whatever the code is. So imagine that sleep as a placeholder for add complex processing behavior here. And then once I've actually done that complex closing behavior, I can then use set transient to put that to the cache. So that then, again, makes it available for me. So the next time the user comes into this call, given that we're within the time period that we set up for that key will exist. So when we do a get transient, it'll just return that and we won't need to do all that extra processing again. So that'll help you kind of speed things up a little bit for performance and just make your code a little bit neater as well. One of probably the most common uses that you're going to have is maybe having shortcodes that require some kind of user input or feedback or behavior that you then need to validate in the backend. Now, that can be done by using Ajax calls to the backend, but we obviously need a few things here. Like we need to be able to render the form that the user sees, and we also need to add in the functionality for handling when that occurs. So let's look at doing that quickly. So let's just say I've got my, standard little Ajax form here, and I've got this little function for it. Again, I'm passing my attributes there. And in the action, I want to define the actual function that I want to call when that hits, and maybe a success message, which allows the user to kind of modify. So I'm defaulting this to what I'm actually going to be calling. So again, if I do search for this further down, you're going to see my handlers for that. Okay, or I may have an action that I've written for that as well. Okay, so in that case now, I'm just building up my form. And again, I'm just putting some good security practice in here where I'm going to put a nouns for it. So I'm creating a nouns. I'm generating my HTML. And that right here just has my email, it has text, it has a message. So it's just like a standard contact form. And then things that I am putting inside of this, I'm putting in two hidden fields. One contains my nouns and one contains the action. And the action is, in this case, the action that I want to fire off in association to this. And then here's my JavaScript behavior, my script tags. That's basically going to hit the admin URL. And it's going to pass into that, obviously, my values, including my actions and everything else, for that. Now, what I can then do is I can listen in on that with custom Ajax handlers. So in a typical way that we will do Ajax calls with WP underscore Ajax underscore our kind of functions name or our actions name, the same with the no priv if somebody doesn't have those permissions, and then just passing in essentially what we wanted to hit. Now I can just pass in this case, I'm just passing in both the exact same function. And what my function is then going to do is because again, I'm posting this information. If you looked at the structure of my form, I'm using a fetch method in there, and then I'm posting that data. And so in the data, I'm going to have my nouns. So I can then verify the nouns that I've got using WP underscore verify nouns. And if that fails, I can just not permit it. So in case somebody's trying to fake the form or try something else, I'm going to sanitize my data as per good practice, validate my stuff as I need to. And then what I probably want to do is I probably want to send back the data in a JSON format. So I'm using, in this case, WP underscore send JSON underscore success. And that'll update the response, the headers for a success message. Now, naturally, you'll actually be doing something with your logic here. It's not like mine where I'm just kind of looking for a response in general. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Again, please give me some ideas on how I can improve that, or subjects that you'd love to hear about. And if yourself looking for a mentor in this space, or if you're looking for, a partner on that big next level, or a company that can do these things for you, to cross brand all different types of technologies, I'm your guy. Hit me up. Information's down below, and let's keep that conversation going if you're interested. And I will see you in the next episode. Please, again, remember this is part of a series, so links down below.